they eventually applied real justice, real politic, because they had to, because I don't think they have much other choice. A court is as strong as what the political powers behind it want it to be. It can't be stronger than that. And so that particular court, and each court is different, but that particular court had weaknesses from its birth that it could never recover from.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Today we're joined by Thierry Cruvellier, a journalist and author who has spent over 2 decades covering international and transitional justice, as editor-in-chief of justiceinfo.net and the author of acclaimed books such as The Master of Confessions, The Making of a Khmer Rouge Torturer, and Court of Remorse, inside the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He brings a rare depth of insight into how courts reckon with atrocity. Please enjoy our conversation.
My first question to you is based on my reading of The Master of Confessions, The Making of a Khmer Rouge Torturer, which I did back then when I was doing my PhD on the Khmer Rouge. And later I read your other book called Court of Remorse, inside the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. My question to you is, what drew you to these 2 different trials?
Very different reasons, in fact, because I went to cover the Rwanda tribunal because I was covering, as a reporter in the early 90s, I was covering Sierra Leone in West Africa and Rwanda. And of course, the Rwanda story was, I was 27 when I arrived in 94. And of course, that changed my thinking, my professional life in many big ways, just like many other reporters at the time. In fact, there were two sort of groups of the same generation at the time, those in Bosnia and those in Rwanda. And for all of us, these 2 events really shaped our life, personal life, and professional life as well. So when the tribunal was established in Arusha, the UN tribunal, it was clear to me that it was a bit of our Nuremberg moment for my generation at the time. At least that's how we felt. And so I wanted to go and cover these trials because I thought it was a very good way to continue working on the Rwanda story, on the story of the genocide, but in a different way. And through these trials. Now, of course, we were very naive. We had no idea of how long it would take. And we thought it would be like 4 or 5 years. It took 20 or plus. And so I came to Arusha for 5 weeks and I stayed 5 years. And because that became just so interesting to me as a journalist, it was the early days of international criminal justice. There were so many new things about it, and so many ways also to look at it. So that's how I came to Tanzania. That's how also I came to covering these topics. It was my interest in Rwanda and Sierra Leone that led me to cover the tribunals. But then, of course, what happened is that Sierra Leone got a tribunal as well later on. And so I went naturally back to this country that is very dear to me. And that became my beat. For the Cambodia trial, it's different because I was already very specialized in this kind of reporting. And the Doig trial, so the trial of this former commander of the prison, the Khmer Rouge prison in Phnom Penh during the Pol Pot regime, it seemed to me that it would be a very unique case because we knew the man was admitting most of the allegations against him. So it wouldn't be too much of a litigation. And Cambodia applied some French civil law system that allows the trial to be short enough, and the accused responds to every bit of evidence that comes up. So the combination of having someone who essentially pleaded guilty in a procedure that also included victims as parts of the proceedings, they were parties to the proceedings, it seemed to create a situation where it would be a rare event where we can have as much access as possible to the voice of the perpetrator. And I think anyone who's worked on these kind of issues at some point understands that that what the perpetrator has to say or has to tell us about how these crimes work and how do we get involved, or any one of us could perhaps get involved in this, they know. I mean, I haven't invented that. I think Hannah Arendt just put it very clearly in her Eichmann in Jerusalem book. So Doig was that, seemed to be that opportunity. And it did turn out, I think, to be an exceptional trial, very unique, that didn't always resemble a criminal trial, was sometimes more of a truth-telling process, but it was dramatic, and it did offer a pretty unusual opportunity to have the voice of the perpetrator. So that's what led me to go there, spend 4 years in Cambodia, and just to cover this trial and write the book. The difference also between the two books is that the one on Rwanda was written years later, as opposed to the Cambodia book, which I knew would be a book from the start. So that makes it a clearly, I think, better book.
So I mean, you speak about the two things that I latched onto in this, conversation in terms of what you just talked about. First, it's the reference to the duration. You didn't expect the ICTR to extend over such a long period of time. And you also mentioned Hannah Arendt. Now, I started my studies in genocide, on genocide, because of Hannah Arendt and the reading of her work. So as we know, Hannah Arendt in 1961 was dispatched by the New Yorker to Israel to attend the trial that Ben-Gurion had set up to try Adolf Eichmann. Today, while we still embrace her views on absence of thinking, the banality of evil, observations that she drew from the trial, many other scholars, such as Deborah Lipstadt, have questioned the accuracy of her observations of the trial of Eichmann and the conclusion that she reached about him. Most of these conclusions, or most of these newer observations, are based on the fact that it was found that Hannah Arendt was barely present during the trial deliberations. Were you aware and conscious of these charges leveled against her when you were doing your research? And did you try to avoid some of the pitfalls that she was guilty of and she was later accused of?
No, the answer is no. No, I did leave, when I went to Arusha, I did leave with the Eichmann in Jerusalem book with me to reread it because obviously it seemed to be of value for my work. But no, I never went into the whole controversy over that book and over Hannah Arendt's views. Somehow, sorry, that's going to be disappointing, but somehow I'm not very interested. I think the value of the book is so big in many ways that it doesn't really matter if you agree or not. It makes you think. And that's what makes this book so useful and so valuable and hardly comparable to any other, is that it makes you think. It allows you to think deeply about complex issues as opposed to admitting easy answers. So that's why I'm not interested in the controversy. I'm interested in the questions she raises. Of course, I think that personally, I feel very at ease with most of her thinking. But again, I have never found the controversy so interesting. Now, it's true that when I learned years later that Hannah Arendt had actually not spent so much time in the courtroom, that made me smile because it's completely contrary to my way of working. It's central to my approach to this kind of work to be there every day, all the time. I can't write about a trial if I'm not there pretty much all the time. And so I smiled because I thought, wow, how did she do it? Because it looks real, it looks good. But yes, I obviously differ in my approach in that respect, yes. But I didn't do it in opposition to Hannah Arendt.
So I think the other point that you mentioned earlier in the conversation is about the new things that the ICTR raised, which were unprecedented. And for me, I noticed a few things that you mentioned in your book, which I highlighted while reading it. One of it was, for instance, the term génocidaire, which we as genocide studies scholars use all the time. That was a term you mentioned was coined during the trial, and you even went on to say it should be génocidaire, because that's how we basically come up with the subject, the person who commits a certain action is usually EUR, it ends with that. And you said instead it became génocidaire, which is AIRE, that's how it ends. You also mention, I'm not going to say more important things because, how we call someone is important too. But you do mention, I think, also the term real justice, which I think is an extension or a reworking of Bismarck's realpolitik. And this was in a way your attack or your criticism, your cynicism about the way in which the ICTR was conducted. And I would like to hear about that. But I also would like to hear about, and I know you did not delve too deeply into it in your book, but I have read other work by you where you have talked about also how sexual violence, rape more specifically, became the subject of much debate during these trial proceedings.
Okay, that's many different things. Just a word on Génocidaire. I think, honestly, I really think it's an invention by Rwandans. It's Rwandans, I think, who created that word because they are French-speaking, but like in any French-speaking country that is outside French, the language takes different, shapes and sounds, like in Canada or wherever, and so Rwandans just found this word, génocidaire, which is a really great word. What's interesting is that it became so popular that it's a word now, clearly, and it's used in many other circumstances. So Rwandans invented a word that became very useful and used to describe genocide perpetrators in many other instances. So that's interesting. About the real justice or real politics, my point was I was not cynical about it. I think, I mean, unless I wrote something differently, but I think that the critique of the tribunal is not that they would have to apply real justice, meaning justice with the constraints of the political environment in which it happens. The problem was that they would not acknowledge it. The problem was that they would keep telling people that they were pursuing some form of pure justice when it doesn't exist. They could not possibly do that, and they were not doing that. They were running their trials very much under political pressure and making decisions because of the political environment in which the court was created and in which they were working. And so my criticism was not that they would have to do that. I think that's the case for any court, anywhere. The idea that the courts can work outside the political and social environment that they are created in, this is ideology. It's applying a form of ideological human rights paradigm, which at some point becomes a religion when you say things because that's what you aim at or that's what your ideal is, but it never is that ideal. So yes, I think that's always been my criticism against all the courts I've covered, is that sort of level of hypocrisy between their claims and what they actually do. And I have no problem with the political constraints they work in. I have a problem with the hypocrisy. So I think that's what I meant by they eventually applied real justice, real politic, because they had to. Because I don't think they have much other choice. A court is as strong as what the political powers behind it want it to be. It can't be stronger than that. And so that particular court, and each court is different, but that particular court had weaknesses from its birth that it could never recover from. I don't know if you want to go back into this, but
yes, I definitely want to hear about the weaknesses because, I mean, my own reading of Rwanda and post-genocide Rwanda just keeps raising tons of complications. Even, for instance, there is a very interesting article about René Le Marchand, who did extensive research as a scholar in that region. And he also speaks about the governmental censorship that has been enforced in Rwanda in, for instance, making sure that people do not refer to each other as Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa, because these were the discriminatory tendencies that, led to the genocide in question. And as we know, the Tutsis have been targeted repeatedly by the Hutu parties and other parties over an extended period of time. The 1994 genocide was just one of the many perpetrations against the Tutsis. So what are the many complications or complexities of the Rwandan genocide that you are privy to, that you now know about after having explored and researched that area, and also now with hindsight?
I'll start with the court to continue from where I was. It's very specific. What is very specific to me about the Rwanda Tribunal And that is reflected in the French title of the book, which is Le Tribunal des Vaincus. It doesn't translate well in English, so I couldn't keep the same because then, but it's in French, victor's justice is la justice des vainqueurs. And so it's, but I found that the Rwanda Tribunal was that very unique example of a court that was not established and not run by those who won the war. Only one group won the war. It was the RPF, the rebel Tutsi-led movement, who took power in 94. They won the war and put an end to the genocide. No one else. Everybody failed. Everybody else failed. You know, the UN left. The US never intervened and took a long time before even using the word genocide. The French, of course, were very, very tarnished because they had been the allied of the Hutu government before, and they were blamed for actually helping them to train, and so they were completely discredited. And they only sent back some soldiers for the evacuation of foreigners, but that was it. The Belgians were also blamed for their colonial past and how the roots of this whole racism, the racist system targeting the Tutsis was created by the Belgians. So they were also blamed. Plus, they also left because they lost 10 soldiers on the very first day of the genocide, and so they moved out. And the African Union never intervened. Everybody failed, Rwanda. And yet, that court was created by the United Nations, by the Security Council, with one country voting against it, Rwanda, who had a seat at the UN Security Council as it happened at the time. Because that's not the court they wanted. They didn't want a court outside Rwanda. They didn't want a court where they would not be part of it. And plus, there were a number of other issues, including the death penalty at the time. But this was a court created by the very powers who had failed. That is in the DNA of this court. And I think it explains a lot of the behaviors of the judges themselves, of the prosecutors, of the states behind it, the Western states in particular, because they had that guilt. So that's why I chose eventually the title became Code of Remorse, because that's another way to look at it, which is that what's essential in this code is that it's created out of guilt, out of remorse. And that affects deeply the way its actors are going to behave and are going to understand their role and are going to agree on the limits in which they can work.
You do many things in your books. You present transcripts of the deliberations, in other words, what was really exchanged conversation-wise in court. You retrace biographies of judges, prosecutors, defense counsels, and also perpetrators, survivors, and victims. What did you find the toughest to do in collecting this material?
Oh, the toughest part is by far attending the trials on a daily basis and hearing the witnesses and the testimonies. I mean, you know, it's obviously the hard part of the work, especially if you do it over a very long period of time. That's the hard part. I mean, at least emotionally, psychologically, that's the hardest part to deal with. And when you get into the writing, I think the challenge is to be able to convey as much as possible these the tension, the emotions that you have in the courtroom, without basking into the horror. You have to remain sober. You have to be sober in your writing when you write about what these victims tell. So I think that's a hard part. There's another one that is of a completely different nature, but that it is something I have to fight with all the time, is the disillusions that you have when you cover these international tribunals. They're not good. There's a lot of mediocrity. There's so much lack of rigor and attention to facts and complexity of history in the way these courts work, and so much arrogance from those who are working in them, that you also have to tell that story, which is, this is not a dream place. This is not an ideal court with amazing people, the best judges and prosecutors and lawyers in the world. Absolutely not. And that myth that that we have to deconstruct, that's also a hard part of the work, because, again, to use your word earlier on, you absolutely need to avoid being cynical. Cynicism is not interesting. It's not, if you become cynical about something, then stop covering it. Move on. And so you have to avoid that cynicism, but while being very honest about what you see and what you've seen, which is not the ideal of justice that many advocates, human rights NGOs, and of course the courts themselves continue to portray to the public in their many press releases and conferences, etc. We absolutely have to deconstruct that myth for the sake of all of us to have a much better understanding of what justice is about, and stop having a religious attitude towards it, but understanding it as a profoundly imperfect instrument that human beings have created to organize their society when dealing with violence that destroys them. Nothing more. It's a very human behavior. And so that, I think, is very much at the center of a lot of my work. And it's not a pleasant part.
I mean, I am very tempted here because I've always, waged wars against theory and wanted more practical examples, even, as a student when I was in school. And recently we had Shell Anderson, who spoke about Dominic Ongwen's trial, the Ugandan child soldier. And he also brought up, maybe not necessarily on the platform when we were interviewing him, but we definitely talked extensively about the imperfections of the trial system, about how people expect it to be a pure institution, but it's not. And I think many of us, I mean, myself being, with 2 law degrees and having been exposed to a lot of trials, I'm aware of the extent of disillusionment I went through myself. So I want to know, for our audience, what are examples, concrete examples of these imperfections, these moments when you realize how mediocre or human actually the trial system is?
Well, there are probably hundreds of them. If we stick to Rwanda, to the Rwanda tribunal, there were levels, in many occasions, there were levels of misunderstanding of of what the politics of Rwanda were at the time of the genocide and before the genocide and what led to it, that were so profound that you just wonder, like, how are you going to judge a case that is deeply rooted in political history and in culture of a particular place? So that I have seen everywhere. But concrete examples, I don't know. I mean, I can remember a moment where a judge decided, so the rule, I can't remember what article it was, but they had to deal with that article because their judgment had to be based on this article of the Code of Procedure. And in the article, the word was clearly, okay, let's choose one, it was clearly before. And that judge decided that before meant after, because they needed the after to have the ruling that they wanted for political reasons. It was in the Barraguza case. So it's one example, concrete, when in writing, the judge tells you after means before, or the other way around. And you're like, so, and just for political expediency, because that allowed the judges to make a ruling that was in their favor, that pleased them.
I was reading this article called I Was Sick During the Genocide, and it's written by Christine Stansel. And she mentions, this is a spring 2007 edition, by the way. So she's here speaking about Lars Waldorf. And she's like, Waldorf told me about one episode he'd witnessed when the judges inadvertently miscalculated the sentence at the end of a trial. That is the term, the time already served and community service affect the final sentence. The prisoner was too upset to notice, and no one in the crowd seemed to have caught the mistake except Waldorf. His recourse was to inform the two NGOs monitoring the trials about the oversight, but there is no formal means in gacaca to lodge an appeal. So this is about what went on during the gacaca, tribunals. But I think this does connect with what you're saying right now about sometimes the lack of professionalism or the lack of rigor, to use the term that you used earlier, that went on in the conduct of all of these trials. So we're not just talking about the ICTR, which you're referring to, we're also talking about the gacaca trials afterwards.
Yeah, but there are so many examples. I think that I referred to one also in the book about this Turkish judge who actually has never been a judge in his life, is a professional diplomat. And it was that trial where a mayor was prosecuted, and at some point he was asked, well, why didn't you call the gendarmerie, the military police, or the local police, or the army? And of course, the guy said, well, I couldn't do that. But the Turkish judge eventually blamed him for not calling the air force of Rwanda. Of course, there was no air force in Rwanda. So that Turkish judge eventually was the only one of the three judges to convict that mayor, was the first acquitted person before the court. And he convicted him for war crimes, on the basis of this kind of positions and findings. And so this is the level you have sometimes, at least, and regularly enough to make it, part of what we see at these courts. So there are many examples of that. I mean, I don't know what Lars Waldorf, what particular incident he was referring to, and Lars has covered the gacaca like almost no one else. So I am sure that he has seen worse than that. but you have to, I would also say that you can hardly compare the means of the gacaca with the means that the ICTR, the Rwanda Tribunal, had. I mean, gacaca courts were led by citizens like you and I, or even, and with probably much less access to higher education, etc., in circumstances that were the ones in Rwanda at the time with very few means. So, of course, you're going to have this. And you know, that bothers me less, like all the national and local processes that I have covered. I am much more comfortable with them in that respect, because I don't have to deal with this level of hypocrisy and lack of integrity when you have all the means that the UN tribunal has, because they do have means, and when you claim to be the best trained and the most knowledgeable judges and lawyers in the world, then you have to be judged by these standards. So yes, I have no pity when I cover these courts and when I write about those in charge, because they claim to be the top lawyers. Well, if you're the top lawyer, then your standards must be the best standards, and they're not. As opposed to when you go and cover local justice processes like the gacaca, where you're not going to apply the same standards and expectations. You're going to agree on this is justice in this context with these means, and you can have incredibly interesting courts and justice systems and trials in the most poor places you can find. Some of these trials, for instance, I'm just moving to different examples, but there have been a number of trials before military courts in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, in the past several years, and they work in extreme conditions, holding their trials on site in Eastern Congo, which is incredibly challenging in terms of equipment and anything. Basically, they have almost nothing. And yet, they organize war crimes against humanity trials in these circumstances. Well, some of them, I think, have come to findings that no international tribunal has managed to actually even address. I'm thinking about environmental crimes, and including the idea that destroying nature in Eastern Congo while waging a war is part of what you are going to be prosecuted for and convicted. Well, which international tribunal has come up with any jurisprudence on environmental crime? Zero, none. So you can have local courts working in the hardest conditions, coming up with a simple, it's not super sophisticated legal terms, and so what? But with a finding and an understanding of what such crime can be, that is much more contemporary and much more useful than what international courts can achieve. We must be very careful not to be impressed by the apparent sophistication of these courts.
So I mean, I really think we have to delve into this important question, which I think, again, I raised when we were talking about the Dominic Ongwen trial as well. Because when we were dealing with the Dominic Ongwen trial, this was a Western trial system being imposed on this completely different and distinct culture, where, for instance, agency was influenced by all means, by factors such as spirituality and the belief in magic. You know, there were spirits from the alcoholic culture that were guiding the actions of all of these child soldiers, including what Joseph Kony himself said. So my question to you, and I think this has not been delved into enough in all, at least in so far in what I've read on the literature on Rwanda, my question to you is, you having been in that environment, which was probably foreign to you when you went there the first time, because you're from a completely different country as well. What were, for instance, the elements that you gleaned that were important and that influenced that genocide, which were probably not brought up in this court that was international? So this kind of goes back to what you're saying earlier about how sometimes some of the most basic, fundamental tribunals set up locally are more effective in rendering justice than any of these international tribunals?
It's a difficult question because I have not really truly researched this in particular. So it's a bit hard for me to tell. But certainly in one of the factors that it just comes to mind, like one of the factors, for instance, that many historians, serious historians who've worked on the decades before the genocide, it's the pressure on land, for instance. Well, that factor, for instance, I have pretty much never heard about it at the UN tribunal. It's completely absent from the analysis. And I'm not saying that it has to be central to their work, not at all. I mean, they're dealing with criminal cases, facts, bam, bam, bam. But because they also had the ambition, they claim they're not here to write history, but they actually dream of doing it, and they're doing it. Well, then if you take that responsibility, you'd better work properly. And of course they can't, because they are not historians and because they don't have the knowledge. Sometimes they even say that they don't need the knowledge. There's a whole chapter in my book that I call the principle of ignorance, which was amazing. There was a point in time in the early days of the court where judges decided that they need not to go to Rwanda and to learn the history of Rwanda to be better judges. You see the level of absurdity that we can reach sometimes. They would not refer to these kind of factors in their narrative of the causes of the genocide, the history, etc. Of course, they would mention very important aspects of it, the role of the Belgium, the colonial power that imposed these identities on people, that created these ID cards where you're a Tutsi or a Hutu and you remain that for the rest of your life. That created all this discriminating system, one against the other, and then in reverse. So all this was there because it's true. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not relevant, but it's also the easy part to tell the story. It's the easy part of the narrative. And you can actually even make it a bit of a caricature, and it's going to be an easy read for the outside audience. It's a simple tale. There's no simple tale. And so if you start talking about land pressure, for instance, it becomes much more complicated. It's not very exciting, and it doesn't make for a sharp, good story for the others. Yet, it is part of the story too, and it is a factor that you have to understand as well, to understand how the violence can also spread like that. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a central key factor. I'm saying it's one of the factors that is real and that is very ignored because it doesn't serve a simple narrative.
I want to go back to these issues of what is unique about the Rwandan genocide and what the ICTR's objectives were. So, for instance, all the perpetrators were divided into three categories. The first one was defendants accused of planning or orchestrating the genocide or committing torture or rape. The second category was those accused of murder or causing injury. And the third category were those accused of looting and pillage. Now, if you take the first category, these were the 93 individuals who were indicted by the ICTR. Now, 75 people were tried and convicted for their roles in the genocide and for crimes against humanity. 14 individuals out of these were acquitted. But let's talk about the rest of the people here, category 2 and category 3. Many of them were put in jail, and many of them later were released because they were pardoned by the government, Kagame. So eventually, what was unique about the Rwandan genocide was that perpetrators, unlike the Cambodian case, for instance, where survivors outnumbered perpetrators, what was unique about the Rwandan case was that perpetrators outnumbered survivors, from what I've read. And so there was a big problem of how do you move on from a genocide after it has happened in that society? So most literature today on Rwanda is about reconciliation, forgiveness, forgetting, remembrance. We also bring into the picture the work of Paul Ricoeur, whose work is on these issues. So I know that your work was centered on covering the tribunal, but I am sure that you had to face these issues as well. So we've not solved the problem of reconciliation. And what worries me is if we look at the extent of perpetrations, the number of perpetrations, the number of attacks against the Tutsi. We have in a different paper by Susan Buckley-Zistel, we have, of course, a record here of pogroms against Tutsis in 1959, 1962, 1973, and later on in 1994. What we know, and if you want, one of the sort of like givens circulated among genocide studies scholars is that if you study the attacks directed to any population and you study them in depth, you realize that it keeps happening. So if you take, for instance, the Armenians, you find that the attacks against the Armenians have been going on not just before the Second World War, but even recently in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh. So my question to you is, if we don't work on this problem of reconciliation in Rwanda, there is always a chance that this is going to happen again. So where are we at in terms of trying to solve the problem? And I know we don't have easy answers to this because we are still debating this, but I'm wondering, what was your connection to this problem or to this matter when you were doing all your research?
Yeah, so we're moving back to in Rwanda, because the work of the UN Tribunal, of course, on reconciliation is irrelevant. It's not where it's happening, and the court was certainly not equipped to do anything about it. That's fine. But of course, in Rwanda, it became, at some point, it became an official objective because I think there is that understanding that they have no choice. The survival of Rwanda as a state and as a society is intimately linked to their capacity to live together, Hutus and Tutsis. And that has been shattered by the genocide. And so nobody knows how you recover from such an extraordinary destruction and have that society having no choice but to live together and build it together over again. It's hard to have a comparison, because in Cambodia there was a bit of that. It was Cambodians killing Cambodians, and all Khmer people have to live together and share the land. But it was different because everybody was a target. It was not because you were a particular Khmer. At some point, everybody was purged. Everybody would be killed. And so, in a way, the Cambodian society was also completely shattered by the Pol Pot regime. But the possibility for them to live back together was different. I'm not saying it was easy, because perpetrators and victims had to live side by side, the same way that happened in Rwanda, and that's an incredible situation. But it was different than in Rwanda, and so for Rwanda, it's an existential duty to succeed, because otherwise, as you say, it will come back. I mean, once the machinery has been shared by a generation, the machinery of death, of destruction, it seems to remain, at least for a long while, not forever. I mean, I come from a Protestant minority group in France. We're 2%. And in the 16th century, by today's language, we would say that we've been genocided by the Catholic Church, right? That's what happened. At the time, the word didn't exist, but that's what it was. Well, very few managed to stay. And 200 years ago, Protestants got their rights back with the revolution. And that has never changed ever since. Am I threatened by another pogrom in France today? No, absolutely not. Is there a deeply rooted possibility that hatred could be revived? That would take a hard work. It's not there. So good. There's hope that you can actually survive this and not repeat it. But it takes a long time. It takes generations, I think. And the memory remains. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the threat, you can actually, I think the hatred, you can work on it. The memory, it stays. It's 400 years ago, and in the community where I'm from, we know, right? So Rwanda has to deal with this, and it's 30 years ago. You can imagine that we won't have the answer. We won't know the answer in our lifetime. It's an extraordinary undertaking that they are obliged to do. And what was interesting in the justice process in Rwanda was, I think it challenged some cliche, some ideas that you hear all the time. One is you can't have mass justice after mass murder. It's going to necessarily be selective, because how can you prosecute so many perpetrators? Rwanda completely changed that agreed preconceived idea by saying, no, everybody is going to be prosecuted. And they prosecuted more than 1 million people. It's unprecedented. There's no other case. And my discussion here is not to qualify the quality of the gacaca. Was it good? Was it fair? It's a mixed bag. You can find everything you want in the gacaca. That's not my problem. What I'm talking about is that Rwanda proved that you can have mass justice after mass murder if you decide it. It's a political decision, and it requires to be very creative. So they created these gacaca courts that were without precedence. So, you create 11,000 courts in the country run by people like you and me, etc., etc. A complete creation out of anybody's minds. I mean, none of these international lawyers would be, would manage to create this. But here there was the political will to do that. It was very clear that they wanted everyone to be accountable, including those who just stole a cow from a dead Tutsi neighbor. Everyone was accountable for anything they profited or did during the genocide. And they did. So Rwanda challenged that idea. And now I think of course, you can still say that in almost every circumstance, there will not be mass justice after mass genocide, mass murder. It will always be selective, but not necessarily. It's not a no that you cannot have mass justice. You can, you decide, and you organize. You invent a system that allows it. Two, because you're a poor nation, you cannot afford reparations. You hear that all the time, everywhere, and in every place, it's sorry, we cannot organize reparations because we're poor. Rwanda is a poor country, and it organized reparations. Again, my point here is not to debate on how it worked, how level of corruption there was in the process, who benefited, who did not, etc., etc. That's not my discussion. My discussion is that they did manage to organize a real reparation fund with a real reparation program of a scale that is hard to imagine for a poor country. They were creative. They had a tax, they organized a tax in particular that everyone had to pay, small one, but a small tax that you multiply by 10 million, and that is a bit higher for companies or businesses, etc., etc. That makes millions. And all of a sudden, a poor country has a trust fund for the victims that has got millions in it. Interesting, right? So I think in that sense, the Rwanda experiment, beyond all and again, there's a lot of things that went wrong, a lot of unfair trials, unfair convictions, lots of problems. But it's a fascinating and interesting place and unique case study in many respects for that, because they are bold in what they can invent. I'm far away from your reconciliation thing. Reconciliation became more and more the objective. The years were passing on, and each time it seemed that each time the political power understood that they had a bit more room for being more lenient with perpetrators and empty the prisons and bringing all these guys back into the society, they were doing it. And eventually, which was very demanding to genocide survivors, they had to go through a lot to accept that. But and so eventually the whole point of reconciliation became very central to the whole process. But reconciliation is such an impossible thing to assess and to truly understand. I think reconciliation is an official political position. It's what the government said it was about and had to be. So Rwandans have an obligation to reconciliate with each other. But at the personal level, at the individual level, how do we know? And it's going to be very different from one person to another. It's a very, very complicated thing to assess and to actually really understand. And so I won't go into this. I think I'm unable to do that. And for the fact that Rwanda can overcome this and not do it again, I think there is no reason to say in history that the society cannot overcome this. But I have no idea if it will now or much later after other massacres. It's impossible to know. It depends on so many factors that it's hard to know, but it would take generations.
As we are still discussing this post-conflict Rwanda, I want to bring attention to a recent publication on Justice Info. Justice Info recently published the report of the 1991 Rwandan Military Commission, which had never been made public. Now, you wrote that in the eyes of the prosecutor of the ICTR, this extract formed the basis of the criminal conspiracy that led ultimately to the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994 and the explanation of its planning therefore. Can you tell us what is detailed in this report and how it may open the door for further historical analysis?
So that report was a military commission report led by the famous Colonel Bagosora, who eventually got prosecuted and convicted for genocide at the UN tribunal and has been considered as the brain behind the genocide, which is another very simplistic idea because we need a brain. And so we always have a brain, and in Europe there's a brain in Bosnia, there's a brain in Nazi Germany, etc. And here in Rwanda we needed a brain, and it's a more complicated story, yeah. But Bagosora turned out to be the brain. Anyway, so he was heading that commission back in '91. So when the civil war had started for a year now, that commission was commissioned by the president to give advice to how you run this war and how you win this war on different fronts. And an extract of this report has always been known from the days right after the genocide that addresses the ethnic dimension and that defines the enemy. And it's a very ethnically based part extract that regularly seems to confuse the rebel, the Tutsi rebel, the armed rebel, with any Tutsi, all Tutsi. So this extract has always been part of the theories behind the planning. And the prosecutor of the Rwanda court went as far as saying that this was the birth of the planning of the genocide, that commission, without having the full report, only based on that extract, which is a bad piece of work. Let's be clear, and it's a highly problematic, racist part of the report. The very few top senior officers of the Rwandan army who opposed the genocide 3 years later in '94. So how can you be one of the very few officers of this army to courageously oppose the genocide in April '94 and be a member of the conspiracy 3 years before? There's always been a problem with that commission. And back to your question, to your point earlier on, Sabah, here is one of these examples of this mediocre, lazy work by foreign prosecutors who want an easy narrative, disregarding any complexity in history. But so we knew the members of that commission, and obviously there was a problem. How can it be the basis of the conspiracy when some of its members became the rare opponents to the massacres. And so, unfortunately, that report was never available to anyone at the time. And eventually, so I was given that report. I don't know exactly. I think we know there is a copy of it in Kigali. I think that's what I understand, but it was never released. And that would be the only second copy. Of course, I got a copy of the copy, I didn't the original. But that would be the only, I think, the second copy that existed. And so somehow I eventually got a copy of it. It won't be of any use for trials now. But for historians, I think it's important to have it because the report shows that it was more complex, obviously, that commission. Mm-hmm. And we knew it was more complex because of its membership. Mm-hmm. But now we can have a better understanding of what they had in mind and what was this report about. And in particular, I think I would draw attention to I think that in the last part of it, they're actually calling for political democratic opening of some sort, etc., for some, democratization of the political landscape. It's in 91. This was certainly not a call to conspire to commit genocide. It's a much more complicated moment in the history of the Rwandan army. And I think and I hope that having the full report now, we can perhaps have a better discussion about the history of the genocide and how it happens in Rwanda specifically.
So I have a last question, and this is about, in general, I mean, it's very clear that, many legal scholars generally are very aspirational. They want trials to be perfect. We want fair trials. We want justice. I think your approach to these trials, just in our conversation about real justice, real politic, is very pragmatic. And that's also very refreshing to me. So since you've researched all of these trials, including the ones that have taken place during your lifetime, with all the experience and breadth you have of knowledge, of insight into this, what advice would you have to give us? Or what are the other things that you've not mentioned in the books that you'd love to share with us?
A trial is an exceptional place to have the pretension to understand the most excruciating and complex thing that can happen to a society, which is mass atrocity, in a way that is manageable, because it's the story of an individual. And so it provides us with a lens that we can manage, as opposed to having to embrace an entire society, an entire history, which is overwhelming, and we can never make sense out of it. A trial is a trial of an individual, and that individual, you can sort of have the illusion, because it's an illusion, to capture it. And so I think in that sense, the fascination to me has never fully ended, because each time it's a new individual, it's a new story with its own specificities, and that sort of revives the interest. The other thing is, these trials are theaters, and so if you're a writer, it's easy, it's fantastic. It's a collection of characters that are provided to you right there in one place. It's one tragedy in one place, usually with one individual, the accused. It's a theater. And so for a writer, it's fantastic material. It's very rich. And you can, if you get bored with the law, and I do, then you move to psychology, or you move to philosophy, or you move to politics, or you move to history. There's so many ways you can sort of work on a war crimes trial. I'm saying war crimes as a generic word, right? That it's hard to resist, like, and the drama can be big. I mean, there's a lot of boredom. You remember the New Yorker sent Rebecca West to cover the Nuremberg trial. And she had that fabulous idea that she called the Nuremberg trial that lasted only a year, 1 year. I mean, I would dream of an international tribunal that lasts 1 year. 1 year, and she called it the citadel of boredom. Oh, how good is that? There's so much boredom when you cover a trial. It's a very boring process. And so that's the hard part. I forgot about that one, but that's the hard part. But in that boredom, the drama is spectacular. I mean, what could be more dramatic than having to establish the guilt or innocence of a man or a woman who is charged with mass murder, with being part of the destruction of an entire group or a society? I mean, what bigger a drama it can be, right? So I guess that's what keeps me going. I think intellectually, it's endless what you can think about. Now, I'm not inviting anyone to do that for their lifelong. I think it's very unhealthy. I think it's sick. I am not proud of what I have done with my life, but I'm satisfied with how it fed me intellectually and humanly. Yes, I learned a lot, and I think that's what keeps me going. Just make sure if you do that, make sure you have really, really very good friends around who can talk to you about something else, and in particular the beauty of the rest of life.
I think of the this is just a last question / comment, depending on where it goes. But while you were speaking, I did think about that feeling of absurdity, which Franz Kafka talks about when even he writes his piece, The Trial. But even more than that, when I think of, say, Albert Camus' L'Étranger, The Outsider, that feeling of like, that murder happening on that bright day, people judging him because he went out with his girlfriend when it was the time of his mother's funeral, and society expects him to behave a certain way. Just the absurdity of all of these situations. So even back to Kafka, that feeling of waking up by Gregor Samsa and feeling like the world's changed and you've now transformed into this bug. Just this entire feeling of absurdity which exists in these stories that I just mentioned.
Yes, the absurdity of life is such rich material for writers. You name two big ones out of them. Camus' response to the absurdity of the world was action. He was totally convinced about the absurdity of our condition. But his response was that you still have to be part of it. You have to take action, not to challenge the absurdity of it, but just because that's our condition. That's our human condition. But I don't know, for some reason, this is the way for Camus to make sense of it, or to live it. To live it fully is just to be part of it and be active. And I think that's a good response, because you're not fighting the absurdity, you're comfortable with it. But you're not cynical. You're not cynical about it. You just consider that it's our condition and then move on and live it. So I think it's a protection from cynicism. And it's just as much as being very aware of the absurdity of our condition is protection from hard beliefs and religious lines of thought. Purity. You used that concept earlier on. Pure ideas, which are the most dangerous ones, including when they apply to justice. And they do in the human rights world. There is that sort of purity idea that is misleading and dangerous. So if you're convinced about the absurdity of life, you cannot believe in purity. You cannot believe in pure ideas and ideologies. It's gone. So it's a protection from this, and to be protected from the bad sides of the absurdity of life, which would be to be cynical, then you act, you live it. In that sense, I think Camus found a very good balance, in my view.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Thierry Cruvellier. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.